with our interactions with police and other institutions are commonplace among African youth everywhere. So it doesn't matter if you're here in Halifax, Nova Scotia, where I live, or if you're in California in the United States, where Ajumu lives. This happens all over the world. And we want to address it. We want to show youth that we understand that this is happening, that this is a systematic problem and it's not their fault. We want to give youth the tools to help them work through how to deal with the problem when it does happen, and how to, just as importantly, how to recognize and embrace your worth and your value as a human and as an African. So first, we want to acknowledge the Indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere. These are the people who are the rightful caretakers of these lands. These are the people who have been brutally and viciously, or the lands have been brutally and viciously stolen from their ancestors. We are on their land and they have every right to have their land back. And we as a justice-loving people need to commit to help them get back their land. So we always respect, appreciate, and acknowledge the Indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere. We also acknowledge our African ancestors, of whom we stand on their shoulders. We recognize and acknowledge every opportunity granted to us today is because of their resilience, their struggle, and their sacrifice, and their shed blood. We are thankful for the spirit of resistance that is within us, that was given to us by them. So we acknowledge them in all we do. So let's get started. First, I'll introduce myself, and then I will introduce Ajamu, and he will lead us into a presentation on the history of policing here in Nova Scotia and in Halifax. I'll also quickly add that I think it's important that we first understand the history of policing if in fact we're going to be able to address the challenges that we face at the hands of police. It's just like Michael Jordan or Kobe Bryant, how in preparing for a basketball game, they would sit down and study video footage of their opponent so that they would be able to be better equipped for what's up next. That's exactly what we're going to do. So my name is Cheyenne Jones. I was born here in Halifax. I lived in Nova Scotia my entire life, except for about 12 years where I lived in Toronto, Ontario. I am a university student studying international development. Don't like bullying of any form or fashion. And so quite frankly, the reason we decided to put this together today is because I'm tired of the Africans in Nova Scotia being bullied. And for those joining in from Halifax, I know that you're aware of the recent racist incident of the single mother who was, while shopping with her 2 young babies in Walmart on Mumford Road, was attacked by police and arrested while she was shopping. I'm sure that this incident had great impact on you. It also impacted me greatly. When I saw the picture of her face, this young, beautiful woman's face, and I saw that it was swollen and the bruises and the black eye, and I read about her injuries, I not only wept for this woman, but then I got angry. And I realized that something has to be done about this. And I started to think, like, what would I do if I was in her situation? If I was shopping down Walmart, which is 10 minutes from here, if I was alone, if I was with 2 young children, and I was accused of being, of shoplifting, how would I react? Would I react the same way she did? If I was, if I offered to show them the receipt and they called the police anyway, what would I do? 5 or 6 police officers came, what would I do? They're throwing me down, arresting me, attacking me in front of my children, taking my children from me and putting me in jail for the night. How would I respond to that trauma? And so I thought about that and it tore me apart. And this Navigating Through Darkness was birthed out of that. I connected with Ajamu and we came up with Navigating Through Darkness. I'm going to put it right out there. This is my first time doing anything like this. I've never done a Facebook Live before. So I am hoping that you'll be patient with me while we go through the process. Ajamu, on the other hand, is a seasoned veteran. So I'm going to be looking to him. I'm going to be looking to him a lot for this. But I met Ajamu through our work with the All African People's Revolutionary Party. Every single conversation I have with this gentleman, I leave feeling empowered and I learn something new. And I have full admiration and respect for him. Through all of his accolades, one of them is he's an accomplished author, and he's not expecting me to hold up his book right now, but I'm going to do that. And the reason he's smiling is because he's a humble person and doesn't want to make this all about him, but he's an incredible author, and I highly recommend this book. But with that being said, Ajamu, why don't you take it from here?
Thank you. That was very nice. So we're here again, as Sister Cheyenne said, to talk about specifically Canada in general and Nova Scotia, Halifax area of Canada in particular, the history of police relations with African people. And when we say African, we mean all people of African descent. And really just what we're going to do right now is I'm going to take you through a brief presentation that's designed to highlight some of the key points of that historical police African community relationship to bring us to the present time to help explain why we experience traumatic events like Sister Cheyenne just described with the sister who was just simply shopping and was having forced to have to go through that terror. And you know, keep in mind, because we're going to come back to this theme, that police terrorism happens to African people all over the world. And we're going to talk about why that is. Like, why does it just not happen in Canada? Why does it happen all over the world where we are? There are reasons why that is the case. So we're going to talk about that. But to get us started, I'm going to go ahead and log us in here so that we can give this some context here. So first, let's start with this. If you talk about the history of police in Canada, if you talk about that, you have to start by talking about an institution that was called the Northwest Mounted Police, or NWMP, as they were called. And so this organization started in 1873, and it later changed its name to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, which is what it's known by today. But it's important to acknowledge this institution because it became the blueprint in Canada for all of its police departments. So when we're talking about what they call the regional police in Halifax, Nova Scotia, that model, like all of the models of policing in Canada, was created based on this model of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, which again was originally the Northwest Mounted Police. And it's also important to note that all of these policing models have roots in Europe, in Britain, in France, in Germany. They all have roots in that, as well as, you know, the processes of articulating people's rights, whether you're talking about constitutional rights, Bill of Rights, as they call it in Canada, or whatever the case may be. All of this derives from European law. So that's important to understand, because if you're not from that tradition, that potentially represents a problem for how you're going to be able to interact with that tradition. So let's just start here with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. 1873, they were created. And the reason why they were created was to create a 300-member militia, basically, whose primary responsibility was enforcing the physical removal of First Nations people, Indigenous people, away from territories where they lived, because those territories were being surveyed by the Canadian Pacific Railway to build Canada's initial railway prospects through the country. So as Sister Cheyenne said at the beginning, opening up the program, just like in every area of the Western Hemisphere, we're talking about indigenous people who were living there peacefully. And we're talking about people who were violently removed, violently attacked, violently disposed of in order to build up the Western capitalist empire. So this was certainly the case in Canada. And, just to reiterate that point, the entire policing program in Canada was created specifically to attack, terrorize, remove the First Nations people, the indigenous people. So, if you fast forward, you understand that knowledge, and you fast forward to today, we're talking about the reality of policing today for people who don't fit that model, people who don't fit what that historical European model of who should be in a specific place at a certain time and space. And so the picture here, it could be a picture that's taken anywhere in the world. It can be a picture taken in France. It can be a picture taken in Britain. It certainly can be taken in the United States of America, where I live. But it's actually a picture of police in Halifax who are have their knees and their bodies on the body of an African there. This picture happened sometime in 2019, but for those of you following recent events here in the Snakes, for example, you know that this brother named Floyd was just murdered by police in the last few days through similar tactics. So this is important to understand because in today's reality, these police forces that exist in these capitalist countries, Canada, the US, Britain, France, et cetera, Australia, they are being trained on a worldwide basis. They are being trained by imperialist intelligence services like the Central Intelligence Agency in the United States, or Mossad out of occupied Palestine, or what they call Israel. They're going into countries and they're training police departments. That's why the equipment they wear is the same. That's why the tactics they use are the same. And if you don't understand what is meant by the term imperialism, we're talking about an international system where multinational corporations go into other countries to steal and control their resources. So this is a worldwide system of control over the masses of people on earth. So they go in, they train these police departments on how to engage in these tactics. And the everyday police that walk the streets may not even necessarily know where the training is coming from, but it's all being done internationally. So these tactics, even though, this picture is in Halifax, it can be taken anywhere. So if we talk specifically about Halifax policies, between 2006 and 2017, the regional police there instituted a practice called stop and search. And if you look at that 11-year period, what happened is that almost 100,000 people were stopped in Halifax. And what this looked like is that, you're going on about your business. You're walking down the street, you're driving down the street, you're on public transportation, whatever the case may be. And then suddenly you're approached by police officers who are demanding that you stop and comply to the orders that they're giving you. And this process was designed according to, its manifesto to ensure that people who were on the streets in Halifax were there to engage in lawful practices and to do those types of things. But of course, when we look at the breakdown of how the stop and search policies were actually implemented, we can see the same systemic discrimination happening, because there are approximately 22,000 African people. And again, if I didn't say it, when we say African, all people of African descent are African. So that's the term that we use to describe us. So 22,000 Africans live in in the Halifax area. The Halifax area population overall is a little over 400,000 people. So African people represent only about 5% of the total population in Halifax. Europeans represent somewhere approximately around 65% of the population. But in spite of that reality, African people account for almost half of all of those 97,000 stop and search practices that occurred, or incidents that occurred in that 11-year period. Almost half of them were our people. So more than 43,000 of the 97,000 people that were stopped were African people, although we're only 5% of the population there. So we're going to talk about what that's about in a second. Like, why is that? Because those of you watching, and I see a number of people are watching who live here in the United States, you know, you hear this, and I know the first thing that goes through your head is that that's the same thing here. You know, we're disproportionate a part of that. And of course, you're absolutely right. And there are reasons for that that we'll expound on in just a minute. We want to just take a second, and we're going to talk about this more in a moment, because what Sister Cheyenne was able to do, which I think adds an interesting component to this conversation, is, and she'll talk about this more in a second, but she was able to talk to a brother who served on the Nova Scotia, the regional police department, for quite some time, and was actually someone who observed and experienced the systemic discrimination against our people in that region, and wrote a book about it, and really kind of went on a crusade to try to expose the inequity of these practices. So she'll talk about that in a second and expound on what I'm going to say here. But we just wanted to go over a couple of brief things, particularly for our youth, you know, in that area as well as anywhere in the world. And one thing that's really interesting is if you look at the Canadian Bill of Rights, it was created in 1960. Again, I mentioned much of this information in terms of defining what people's rights are evolves from Europe. So because of that, a lot of how these things are implemented in the Western Hemisphere mirror each other. So in other words, if you read the US Constitution, and I'm saying that quoting the words of Kwame Ture when he said US Constitution toilet paper, because that's exactly what it is. And I would say the same about the Canadian Bill of Rights as it relates to African people. But if you read those documents, just to read them and understand what's in them, then you will find that there are a ton of similarities. And I actually studied this Canadian Bill of Rights to prepare for this presentation today, and did a side-by-side comparison with the United States Constitution, and they were virtually mirror documents of one another. So, you know, it's kind of the same rap in terms of what you should do and how you should approach the world. And I think, you know, again, we're going to go through this in detail, but the important thing I wanted to say right here is that we as African people, we have to understand, and indigenous people and poor people, we have to understand in clear terms that the police are not here to protect us. They are not here to serve us. And every one of us who continues to try to pursue that fantasy is creating unsafe conditions for all of us. The moment that we recognize and realize that these institutions were not created to protect us, they were created to serve the interests of the ruling empire that they work for, the moment we realize that collectively, the farther along we'll be to eliminating this problem in our lives. And we have to understand that. So I say that because there's no way we can come on here and say, well, if you do this, you'll be safe. There is no safety for us, you all, in these societies. These societies were not set up for us to be safe. There is no safety. The only safety we have is the safety we create ourselves through collectively organizing together. And that is a different discussion. that's an entirely different discussion in terms of how we do that. But it's just important to say that, because we don't want to, and I know I certainly don't want to give the impression that, well, if you have your ID, then nothing bad will happen to you. The moment every breathing, every breath you take, every moment of your life in these capitalist societies, you are in danger. Whether you're in your house, whether you're on the street, on public transportation, driving, at your job, you are in danger. And the moment we accept that sober reality, then the faster we'll be ready to start doing something about it. Okay, so that's what we should know. That's what we need to know, that we're in danger here. And these institutions and these people are not here to protect us. They're here to terrorize us and keep us under control. It's important we accept that. And so the other question, which we'll talk about, is how you should respond when you're stopped. And we'll go through that, and we'll actually do some role plays for people that want to experience that. And we'll talk about things to avoid. We'll do that. And then also things to remember. So we'll go through all of those things in just a moment. But the important point of all of this is, why do these things happen to us? Clearly, this is not just a problem. The information I just displayed in terms of the disparity, the racist disparities in the stop and search program in Halifax, clearly that's not just something that happens in Halifax. So the question is, why does the same type of relationship between African people and police happen in Canada, in France, in Britain, in Australia? There was an urban rebellion that happened in Minnesota. It's been happening over the last couple of days because of the brutal murder of that brother there, Brother Floyd, in Minnesota. And these urban rebellions against police terrorism happen everywhere African people exist. They've happened in Sydney and Melbourne, Australia. Within the last 10 years, there have been African urban rebellions against police terrorism in Sydney, Australia, Melbourne, Australia, Paris, France, London, England, throughout the United States of America. So the question is, why do these things happen to us wherever we are? They're happening. And how can we explain this? And so it's important that we understand that we exist in the Western Hemisphere for one reason and one reason alone, because of the exploitation of our mother, Africa. And I know that that's, like, for a lot of people here, they're like, well, what does that mean? That doesn't make any sense. I'm in Canada. I'm in the US. I've never been to Africa. I don't have no interest in going to Africa. Africa has nothing to do with my life. That what you just said makes no sense to me. Well, it doesn't. Unfortunately, the rules of the universe are not decided by what we decide to believe in our heads. They're decided by objective circumstances. And the objective circumstances exist whether we acknowledge them or not. You need to breathe oxygen. That's an objective circumstance, whether you acknowledge it or not. You need to drink water. That's an objective circumstance, whether you acknowledge it or not. If you don't acknowledge it and you don't drink water, your life will not last long. It doesn't matter what you believe in your head. It doesn't matter what kind of faith you have. Your physical life will end if you don't consume body fluid. That's an objective fact. Well, at the same rate, it's also an objective fact that this exploitation that happened through the transatlantic slave trade created the wealth that spurned the industrial capitalist movement and created wealth for the Western world. And that process requires the continued system of exploitation in Africa to ensure those resources are continually exploited. And because of this process, African people are all over the world, it's important for us to understand how we're viewed wherever we are all over the world. Because even if we don't see ourselves as African people, the power structures in the world see us as African people. And they see us as a threat because we're African people, because they know that their entire system of domination is based on continuing to exploit Africa. And they know that if we someday wake up to that, and stop just thinking of ourselves just in terms of, well, I'm American, I'm African American, or I'm African Nova Scotian. If we grow beyond that level of consciousness and come to realize that these things happen to us because we're African people and we're being exploited, and our mother is being exploited, and they want to continue to maintain that control so that they can continue to steal that columbite tantalite, and they can use it to allow us to communicate as we're doing right now. They can continue to steal the cocoa, and the kids can have the banner in Ghana saying, when you eat chocolate, you eat our skin. They can continue that process. They can continue to steal the oil and the diamonds and the uranium and all those things. The only way that can continue to happen is if we continue to allow it to happen. The only way that's going to happen is if we are clear about who we are and where our interests lie. And so, because there's always the threat that we'll wake up, it's important for these empires to ensure that they keep their foot on our neck to prevent that from happening. It's critically important, you all, that we understand that, because if we don't understand that, then that's why we get confused. You know, here in the snakes, you know, the Europeans are having these protests about, you know, open up, stop the shutdowns of the economy based on the coronavirus. And I see people every day talking about, well, how come the police aren't going after this? They're coming there with those protests carrying guns, and the police do nothing. Well, if you're asking that question, with all due respect, it's because you don't understand this contradiction with Africa that we've just talked about. Those people that are talking about opening up, they don't pose any threat to the power structure. The power structure is there, and what they're proposing actually assists the agenda of the power structure, because by opening up business, that continues the process of capital accumulation, which is all the people that run these empires care about. So those people engaged in those so-called protests are assisting that process. So since they're assisting that, they're helping the status quo. So there's absolutely no reason that the state institutions and agents of repression for the state are going to be called against those people. That's not going to happen. In fact, they're going to support. That's why you see this police saying, yeah, no problem, carry on, you're doing great, because they're doing the work of the system. Whereas when we go on the streets in Halifax, or we go on the streets in Minnesota, that's a direct challenge to the power structure. That's a direct challenge to the status quo. So that's why they release their state agents against us. We have to understand that, y'all. We have to accept that's why that happens. Because they are not there to serve us, to repress us. So with that, we'll stop this portion, and I'm going to turn it back over to Cheyenne, and she's going to again go into the feedback we got from the brother who had experienced policing in the Halifax area.
Okay, so the gentleman's name is Calvin Lawrence, and we reached out to him. We had a conversation with him about his involvement as with policing. He was a RCMP officer for a vast number of years. I think 36. He spent 36 years in policing. The vast majority of those were with the RCMP, and then I think he spent about 8.5 years here in Halifax with the Halifax Regional Police. He's a 7th generation Black Canadian, now retired, if I didn't say that, retired from the RCMP, and was highly decorated. And he wrote a book, I have it here, and it's called Black Cop. And it says, Black Cop, my 36 years in police work and my career-ending experiences with official racism. And so we wanted him to be able to provide some effective strategies for African youth when they're interacting with the police. And we wanted to have him on live with us, but due to some technological challenges, we weren't able to do that. So he just sent in his answers to our questions, and I'll just go ahead and read them, and then we can discuss them. So our first question was, from a Canadian Nova Scotian legal standpoint, what are most effective strategies for youth to use when interacting with the police when walking and when driving? His answer for when walking, and I quote, "If you are stopped when walking, the police officer should explain to you why you are being stopped. If he does not, or is verbally abusive, ask, 'Am I free to go?' If he says no, then say nothing. The police officer should explain why you were stopped. Always remember that there may be a legitimate reason for the stop, and if you are arrested, state that you would like to speak to a lawyer and say nothing else." If you're driving, his response is, and I quote, "If you are driving, always have a valid driver's license, vehicle ownership, and proof of insurance. You must have and show the police officer upon demand. Don't have expired papers mixed in with the current papers. Leave the house in your car assuming that you're going to be stopped. Have the valid papers where they can be reached without the police officer losing sight of your hands, maybe above the sun visor. If you have tinted windows, turn the windows down and turn on the interior light. Cooperate as long as your life is not in danger." We also asked if police officers have the right to ask for identification. And his response is, quote, "If no specific crime is being investigated, then generally the police do not have the right to ask you for identification, but there are valid reasons for asking you for identification, such as entering a bar, legal age to enter a bar, or drinking alcoholic beverages," end of quote. The last question is, do police officers have a right to search your vehicle, your personal property? And his answer, quote, "If there is no valid reason, the police officers should not ask you to leave your vehicle or to search your vehicle. The police officers may ask you if they can search your vehicle, and if you say no and they search it anyway, do not get upset. Follow the same procedure for search of your person or bags you may have. Make mental notes and take human rights action or civil actions if you have grounds," end of quote. So just in hearing those answers, Ajumi, what are some of the first thoughts that come into play for you? You're on mute.
I feel like part of the part of that, like I would like to, I don't know, expound on or clarify, whatever the best way to approach that is. And one is that I think that, and I understand what he's trying to say, but I think that if people's cars are searched, they're going to get upset. And so I think, again, it goes back to, and that's a perfectly legitimate, I mean, if I've had my car searched and I was upset. So I think that, that's unrealistic. People are going to get upset and they have a right to be upset. I think that what I hope he was trying to say, or at least what I'm going to say, is that it's important, again, that we remember these institutions are not here for us. And so when we have to interact with them on that type of level, our focus needs to be on maintaining our safety. Until we get organized with a plan to deal with that, today, May 2020, that has to be our focus, maintaining our safety. So I think that, keep your cool. I would say, instead of don't get upset, keep your cool and, maintain what you have to do. And I think there were some really good points raised, especially around the question of identification. And that's an issue that's consistent even in this country, that, the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution here, and I know the Bill of Rights in Canada, they both state the same thing, that, you don't have to carry identification. That's a common misunderstanding that people have. You're not required to carry identification. Now, as an African who has been stopped by police, the last time I took time to try to remember and count 34 times in my lifetime, I don't go to the bathroom without my identification. But technically speaking, you don't, and I mean, I don't go to the bathroom in my own house without my identification. But technically speaking, you are not required by law to carry identification. So that's a decision you have to make. We would recommend that you carry it just because you want to try to do everything you can to mitigate any opportunity for things to go sideways and against your favor. So that's a very important point, but there are important variables around this identification question that Sister Cheyenne and I are going to role play in a minute that it's important that you be aware of. So that's critical to know. And I think the other thing was just, understanding like, and we have to say this, right? Like if he mentioned quote unquote, paraphrasing, legitimate reasons for you to be stopped. So, that's a question to me, there's you and there's them. You know what you're doing and they know what they think you're doing. So, like I said, 34 times I've been pulled over. Only 4 times was I actually speeding. So 30 times I was just pulled over because they arbitrarily wanted to pull me over. And 2 of those times I was driving a boat on a lake. And one of those times I was on a bicycle. One time I was just walking. And none of those times was I engaged in anything that needed to be investigated. So it's just important to understand that, because the language of they may have a right to pull you over, that might be, that can be problematic. You know what you're doing. They think they know what you're doing. So it's just important that, we always remember, okay, so here they come. This is my strategy that I have in place to address that when it happens. So that's what we want to be able to do for now. We need to do a lot more, but for now, this is a strategy I want to have in place that I want to employ when this happens. So those are the things that I notice.
Yeah, that's great. And I agree. And one thing that I wanted to mention too is, you're right, we need a strategy. And hopefully today that's what we're going to be able to present to people to get them to start thinking of those strategies to keep our youth safer, because we know that we can't guarantee that we're going to keep you safe. And we don't even know if there's anything really that can be done that can keep you safe, but we hope that we'll be able to provide something that will keep you safer. One of the things that I thought was interesting that he had mentioned is leave the house in your car, assuming that you're going to be stopped. Now that's unfortunate that we even have to go through that. We have to deal with that. We're going to go to the grocery store to buy some eggs, and we have to assume that we're going to be pulled over by the police. But I do think I think that's a really good point, and just in terms of being prepared, so it can make your shopping experience a little safer, and you can come home with your eggs instead of ending up in the jail cell.
Or dead.
Or dead, unfortunately, or dead.
Yeah. So how do you feel about role playing right now? I think it's helpful because I know, I can imagine, again, like a lot of the people watching from the States are like, this may as well just be a program about police in the States. It's so similar, you all, that should, if nothing else, that should demonstrate for you, Sister Cheyenne, you in Canada, it should demonstrate for folks there and for folks here how systemic this process is.
That's right. And I mean, you can be anywhere doing anything. I mean, I remember the time when I was here in Halifax. It was many years ago, but I was working at a bank, and I was working in the call center of a bank. And so we were working like evening shifts, and we were allowed to wear like sweatsuits while we were working that 3 to 11 shift. So I was in the mall next door to the bank. For all you Halifax people, this was down at Scotia Square. I worked at the CIBC call center across the street on Cogswell. And I looked at my watch, and I was late. I was late to go return back to work. So I started running through the mall in my gray sweatsuit. And some gentlemen started running after me and came onto the elevator, and I realized right away that they were police. They were undercover, but they started asking me questions. Where are you going? What are you doing? And they're looking at me. They're looking, you can see, I don't have anything. And I told them I'm going to work. Is that okay? And then afterwards, So they went their, they let me go. They went their way. I went my way. But just walking back to the office, I'm like, you know, it sticks to you. It's that those kind of experience stick to you. It doesn't matter if you're in Halifax, Nova, wherever you are, you're going to be, the day's going to come when you have some type of interaction with the police. I mean, mine was just a little bothersome, but the day will come, and hopefully we can help people to be a little better prepared.
Yeah. So ready to role play?
Okay, so I think I'm going to be the police officer, right?
Yeah, you're going to be the cop, because I refuse to play that role. And I'm going to be the person, I'm going to be the person, no, I'm joking. I'll be the person who, you know, is just minding my own business. And
Okay.
then we're just going to take you through one scenario, and then we're going to talk about it.
Okay. So, hey, you, hey there.
Yeah, can I help you?
Yeah, I need you to stop.
Oh, okay, can I help you with something?
Yeah, I need you to come here, and I need to see your identification, please.
My identification? Are you investigating something?
You don't have to worry about that, young man. I just need to see your identification.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, I was just, you know, I have it. I have identification. I was just wondering, you know, because I'm on my way to work. So are you investigating me? Is that why you're asking for my identification?
I'm glad you have your ID on you. I don't need to know where you're going right now. I just need to see your identification. So
okay. So am I being detained? Am I being arrested? Am I being detained?
No, you're not being detained at this moment.
Okay. So I would like to just leave. I want to wish you a good day and have a great day. And there we can stop. And I'll just say that, like, you're looking at that and you're thinking, wow, that's bold. But here's the thing. I mean, I think, like, this is like parenting, okay? There's no manual, there's no one correct way to do it. But so what we're trying to demonstrate to you, we're not saying that that is going to be the best way to do it in every circumstance, because every circumstance is going to be different. And you really have to gauge what makes sense in the moment that you're dealing with. But what we just displayed was, from a quote unquote legal standpoint, the correct way to assert your rights. So, and I've done that many times. And I think if you practice it, you can get to a level of comfort where when you do it, it will work for you. It's worked for me a number of times, you know, because the issue is, if they're telling you they want to see your ID or they want you to do something, and you ask them if they're investigating you or if they're detaining you, if they say yes, then they have to have a reason to do it. You know, at that point, they're committed. They have to have a reason. And if they don't have a reason, that's going to be more difficult for them to do it. And if they say no, then you have a right to leave, and you should do that. So, you know, I'll just say quickly that I see my one of my good friends, comrades, Brother Eduardo, is on here watching, and he's in the state of Texas here in the U.S. And he and I know he'll recall, we did work where we would get on public transportation, a group of us, and we would look for police harassing our youth, in African youth, indigenous youth. And we were a group of Africans and indigenous that were doing this together. And we would stand there. We would replicate the Black Panther Party's approach. We would stand back. And of course, we had no problem finding these incidents because they happen everywhere all the time. And we would talk to the youth in front of the cop about what they could do. And so, you know, there were a couple of times we were able to encourage youth to leave, to, you know, hey, am I being detained, and just leave and do that. So it's something we can do. It's you know, if you practice it, it can be an effective way to address those situations. But I know we wanted to talk about some things to be aware of, right? Some things to be aware of that you want to do in that instance when you're stopped and pulled over.
And I was just thinking, since you brought up the incident with you and your comrade Eduardo on the bus, maybe you can just run us through a quick example of one of these incidents.
So, you know, if you look at the role play that we just did, and of course I know a lot of people watching have had that experience, there are a couple of things we wanted to make sure that we talked about that need to happen. So the first thing is the minute that you get pulled over, if you're driving a vehicle or you're in a vehicle and you see the lights flashing behind me, start recording it with your phone. Start doing that. Just start doing it immediately. Just practice doing that so that that's your instant response to start doing that. And you want to do that, obviously, because that's a record of what's going on. And, you know, it is helpful in the sense that as opposed to if there's no record, then there's no accountability whatsoever. So you want to make sure you do that. So make sure that wherever you're going, whatever you're doing, whether you're in a car, whether you're walking, that you have the ability to do that. You have a device that's going to have enough power to do that. The last thing you want to have happen is to run out of juice. And so you want to have that available to you. So that's one thing. Another thing is, like we said, you know, the recommendation here is that if you have ID, make sure you have access to it. Doesn't mean you have to show it to them, but you should have it, because the problem is if say for instance, and I think this is what Brother Calvin was referencing, if say there is an armed robbery, a block from where you're just walking, you don't know anything about the armed robbery, you're just walking somewhere, but there was indeed an armed robbery, and say someone said, hey, it's a 6'3" African man or black man, or whatever way they describe it, that did it. And so then they come around the corner and they see me and I'm a 6'3" African man. Okay, you know, from their standpoint, at that point, they are investigating you for a crime. So for me, I would rather have my ID. That's why when I ask, are you investigating me? If they don't answer right away, then I know it's just, I'm just being harassed. You know, but there have been times where they've said, yeah, there was a bank robbery at the Bank of America on 3rd and 7th, 15 minutes ago. There was an African man in a white t-shirt. Okay, so, you know, in that situation, I've given them my ID. Because I'm like, okay, if I don't do that, then they're going to just assume that I'm the person that carried out, you know, that activity, and then it's going to take it to a whole nother level. But that's a decision you have to make. So our recommendation is that you have that available to you at all times. So you have your charged device, you have your identification, and that you understand that the best advice ever is never talk to the police. Even the police officer said that. Never talk to the police. Some of y'all, you know, you think you're smarter than they are, and you may be, but they have an entire system backing up what they're doing, and you just have yourself. So when they say, I know here in this country, and they say a similar thing there, I don't know the exact verbiage, but it's very similar. But here, the exact verbiage they use is anything you say can and will be used against you. Y'all need to believe that. They will use anything you say against you. And a lot of times, most of the time when they're talking to you, they have no evidence about anything. And so that's why they're talking to you. So a lot of times you'll say things that help them develop a case against you, even though you don't realize that's what you're doing. And if you were just quiet, that wouldn't happen. So for example, you're walking, they pull you over. Well, we're looking for a robbery suspect. Now, you don't know where the robbery took place. You don't even know if it took place. Because I find it hard to believe anything they say to me. So you don't know what's happened. All you know is that's what they're telling you. So if that happened to me, I wouldn't say a word to them other than the words I said when we role played. You know, are you investigating me? I wouldn't say anything else. But if you think you're smart and you say something like, look, man, I just came from 3rd and 5th. Now, again, you don't know where the robbery took place because it didn't tell you. I just came from 3rd and 5th. Now, that could be close to where the robbery took place, right? So now you've given them something to use against you, even though you don't realize that's what you've done. So that's why, you know, it's better just to remain silent. That is the best advice that anyone can give you when you're dealing with police. Just remain silent. Don't help them create a real or fictional account against you, because anything you say is going to permit them to do that. So I think those are the main points. Now, the last thing I'll say, last thing I'll say is these are survival tactics, you all. It's important we understand these are survival tactics. Like I like to say, roaches survive. You know, roaches, they say roaches can lose their head and live almost 2 weeks after losing their head. That's survival. You know, they can, but eventually they're going to die. They can survive a nuclear blast that, you know, they're coronavirus proof. They know how to survive, but they don't know how to sustain and develop. We're human beings. We should be always striving to not just survive like roaches, but sustain and develop ourselves as human beings. So that requires a higher level of organization. And maybe in one of the future sessions, we can talk more about that. But there are a lot of things we can do. There's building a community defense, a revolutionary community defense model to protect ourselves against police terrorism. That's work we can do to stop this from happening. And you can go to our AAPRP -intl.org site, and there's a video there, building revolutionary community defense, step by step how to do that. That's a higher level of how to address this instead of just reacting to it. And then also there are other tactics involved in that, like de-arresting people. Those of you who've been in the movement know what I'm talking about when I say de-arresting people. If you don't know, we can talk about that. You know, there are things that we can do. We can have agency. We can empower ourselves. We don't just have to react and hope that we survive. So there's survival tactics we're giving you here, and then there's higher level of organizational things we can do to eliminate this problem, abolish police, and move to a higher level of society. So that's all.
Well said. One of the things I just wanted to add that Brother Calvin Lawrence had said, in addition to your what you were saying about not speaking and just being quiet, he also says to remain calm and make mental notes. And the less you say, the easier it is to recount later. He's saying that the best strategy is to make a mental note of the time, date, and location and check to see badge numbers. But again, he's saying the less you say, it's easier to recount in court. So just reaffirming what you've already said.
Yeah.
So like you said, if a police officer is saying it to be quiet, then be quiet.
Yeah. I just, you know, we have a couple of minutes, so if it's okay, I'll just do one more example of that just came to my head. So I had an incident 5 years ago when I lived in Portland, Oregon, where we were building, as we still are there, in other places, a community defense model. And so we had done a lot of work in the community there, and we wanted to, you know, get people to organize around this abolish police movement that we're engaged in. So what started happening is that people started reaching out to us, similar to how they did with the Black Panther Party in the 60s, when they had problems, like domestic abuse problems. They would reach out to us. They didn't feel comfortable calling the police. They would reach out to us, and we would respond. And so one of those incidents where that happened, we responded to an African woman who was being stalked by a former associate, European associate. He was stalking her. And so we responded to that and went to try to address that situation. What happened is that when I went to talk to this person, they ended up attempting to assault me when I, you know, left to leave. And so then I defended myself, and then they ended up in the hospital and they called the police. I mean, the police came to and arrested me. And the reason why they were able to arrest me, I didn't say anything to the police. When they came to me, they're like, were you at this place? I didn't say anything, because if I say yes, then that's, you know, that's giving them fuel. So I didn't say anything. Even though I was there, I didn't say anything. I was just like looking at them. And so the reason why they arrested me, because the cop told me, is because one of the friends of the person who I was helping, who was there observing, the cop pulled them aside, and they told the cop, well-meaning, but they told the cop, well, everything was fine until, you know, he just walked up to the car, meaning me, and everything was fine, and then the guy attacked him. But from the police standpoint, the fact that I walked up to the car to talk to the person to them meant that I instigated the incident, even though I didn't. So, this person making a seemingly innocent comment, was the reason why, that I had to be arrested. So that's why it's just so important not to say anything.
Point made.
And that was our fault because we didn't prep that person. That person was not trained. They didn't, they panicked. I'm no shade towards them. It was our fault. It wasn't their fault. But that's what happens when we're not prepared.
So it's all about preparation, organization,
Yeah.
organization.
Yes. And on that point, the first part towards building beyond just a survival element is we all have to be organized. So we want to invite people to join organizations. You should be a part of an organization working for justice. If you're African, you can join the All African People's Revolutionary Party. You can go to AAPRP-INTL.org, AAPRP-INTL.org. And if you're not African and you don't have an organization, we still, if you're serious, we'll help you start one. So reach out to us and, we can engage and work to help you build, because that's the first step towards building this kind of community defense, where we can't do that if we don't have people organized. So people have to be engaged in order. That is the process we have to engage in. It's great to see people resisting police terrorism in Canada, in the US, in Europe, Australia. But when we get out in the streets, you see this, we do the same thing every time. We're angry, we get out there for 2 or 3 days, they pepper spray us, tear gas us, arrest us, and then we sit down or it's Kwame Ture for 29 years until the next time it happens. So, we have to move beyond that level of reaction into proaction. So we invite people to get engaged so that we can begin to build structures that can eliminate this problem once and for all.
And also on that note, Ajumu and I are
I don't know I think we lost Cheyenne. So it's about time for us to conclude. So I just wanted to close with acknowledging a couple of comments that were made. It was mentioned about armed self-defense. And again, if you watch the video on community defense, that's all a part of that process. But we can't have armed self-defense without organized political education. So the organized political education has to lead the armed self-defense portion. So that's why we encourage people to join organizations. Like, people can practice using weapons individually, but that's not going to do anything to address the problem we face as a people. So we have to get organized to do that. And that's certainly a part of that. And then another point that was raised by good comrade Jossie on Facebook was moving in groups of more than one. Don't move solo. Move in groups, especially, when you're in these towns where they're having these white supremacist protests. Don't go anywhere alone, because that's what they do, is rely on you being alone to single you out and attack you. So I think, again, we lost our sister, but we're going to go ahead, and it's 10 o'clock. It's 10 o'clock our time, 2 o'clock Atlantic time, 1 o'clock Eastern time, 12 o'clock Central Time, 11 o'clock Mountain Time, sometime in the afternoon at home in Africa. So we thank you for joining us. We'll be reaching out about the next program very shortly. If you're interested in these types of talks, we have them every Sunday as well, 4 p.m. Pacific time. We're going to be talking about smashing bourgeois political parties and building not just revolutionary parties. We're definitely going to talk about that because that's what we do, but also for those that are in the parties that are in the electoral processes, talking about how you can build better capacity to get better results, movement building, not just electing individual bourgeois candidates. So join us here. You can watch on Facebook like you are now. And so again, we want to wish you continued mental, physical, and spiritual health. Forward ever, backwards never. Everyone have a great rest of your day. Ready for revolution.